Imagine for a moment. You are standing on the edge of a huge lake, and the dawn sun is coloring the water surface in gold and copper. A light mist rises above the water, and through it, like a mirage, the outlines of a city on the water, a city of temples and pyramids, white stone and majestic. And on the highest pyramid, where the sky meets the earth, sits an eagle holding a snake in its talons. And you realize that before you is not just a city. Before you is a fulfilled prophecy, an embodied legend, a place where the gods touched the earth and showed the way to a whole people. Greetings, my dear listeners. Let me know in the comments what city you're from and what time it is. It always makes me happy to know that somewhere in the silence of the night or in the pre-dawn haze, my words find their way to your heart. Tonight, we will journey through the ages into the heart of Central America, to where the waters of Lake Texcoco once rumbled, where majestic temples rose to the sky, where blood flowed and gold glittered. We will delve into the history of the empire that called itself the Triple Alliance, which we know as the Aztec Empire, a people who came from legends and disappeared in tragedy. Close your eyes and imagine a desert, a hot, unrelenting desert somewhere in the north of present-day Mexico. The 14th century is just beginning, and across the scorched earth wanders a tribe, outcasts, wanderers, people with no home and no future. They call themselves Mexica, and they also call themselves Tenochca. But history will remember them by another name, Aztecs, which means someone from Aztlan, the mythical place of their origin. A country that existed once upon a time, so long ago that no one can remember for sure whether it existed at all, or whether it was just a dream their ancestors had. They are going south, these Mexica, because their god told them to go. Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, fierce and mighty, promised them land, promised them greatness. But first, a sign had to be fulfilled. Somewhere out there, in unknown lands they had not yet seen, they were to find an eagle sitting on a cactus and holding a snake in its talons. Where they would see this sign, there they would stop. There they would build their city. There their story would begin. And so imagine this moment. Long years of wandering, generations born and dying on the road, fatigue soaked into the bones, and suddenly a lake, huge, glistening Lake Texcoco, set in a valley surrounded by mountains. And in the middle of the lake, an island, a small, inconspicuous island, overgrown with reeds and cacti. And on this island, on one of the cacti, is an eagle, a majestic bird with outstretched wings and a snake wriggling in its talons. This happened in the year 1325. In that year, the Mexica founded their city on this island in the middle of the lake and called it Tenochtitlan, the place where the stone cacti grow. The beginning was humble, almost pathetic. The island was small, the land was scarce, and the surrounding peoples looked upon the aliens with contempt and suspicion. The Mexica were nobodies, people with no roots, no history, no power. They had to pay tribute to more powerful neighbors. First, the city of Culhuacan, then Azcapotzalco. But the Mexique had something the others did not. They remembered the prophecy. They remembered that their God had promised them greatness, and they believed. That faith was as hard as obsidian, as sharp as an obsidian knife, as unquenchable as the flame atop the temple. They worked, they built, they fought, they survived. They turned their tiny island into a marvel of engineering. They created artificial islands for farming, chinampas, floating gardens that yielded crops all year round. They connected the island to the shore with dikes, built canals, and erected temples. And in the year 1429, everything changed. The Mexica rebelled against Azcapotzalco and destroyed their oppressors. Suddenly, they were free. Suddenly, they were strong. And then the ruler of Tenochtitlan, wise and far-sighted, made an alliance with two other cities, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Thus was born the Triple Alliance, a political structure that was to determine the fate of all of Central America for the next century. Under the terms of the alliance, the three cities were to harmonize foreign policy, wage wars together, and share the spoils. It was a reasonable treaty based on mutual benefit and necessity. But life rarely follows plans. Tenochtitlan was stronger, more ambitious, hungrier. Its warriors were fiercer, its priests more fanatical, its rulers more determined. And gradually, year by year, generation by generation, the balance of power shifted. Tlacopan, the weakest of the three, had become a vassal of Tenochtitlan, a shadow of its former independence. Texcoco, the city of scholars and poets, remained formally an ally, but in his heart he was envious and resentful as he watched the Mexica grow more powerful. This envy would later play its part. When men in steel armor came, when ships like floating mountains came from the east, the rulers of Texcoco would help the outsiders to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. But that will be later. That will be in the year 521st. But for now, the Mexica are rising. Imagine their empire. But forget what you know about empires from European history. It wasn't the Roman Empire with its legions and viceroys, or the Mongol horde with its total domination. The Aztec state was different, more fluid or something. They conquered cities and tribes, it's true. Their warriors marched through valleys and mountains, conquering one nation after another. But they did not seek to rule directly. They didn't change the rulers of conquered cities. They didn't redraw borders. They didn't impose their laws. Instead, they demanded tribute. Every 6 months, the conquered peoples had to bring a certain amount of goods to Tenochtitlan: corn and beans, cotton and cocoa, feathers of rare birds and jaguar skins, gold and precious stones, and young men and boys for the army. In return, the empire guaranteed political stability, protection from enemies, and access to a developed trade network that linked the entire region. It was a strange empire, an empire of tribute and ritual, an empire held together not so much by fear of military force as by fear of divine wrath. Because the Mexica believed, and made the subjugated peoples believe, that the gods demand blood, that the sun rises every morning only because it is nourished by human sacrifice, that it rains only because Tlaloc is pleased with the gifts brought to him, that the world continues to exist only because of the constant stream of deaths on the tops of temples. But before we dive into the dark waters of Aztec religion, let me tell you how their society was organized. Close your eyes and imagine Tenochtitlan at the height of its power in the early 16th century. A city on the water, a city of white temples and flowering gardens, a city of more than 200,000 people, more than any European city of the time, more than London or Paris. Canoes loaded with goods glide along the canals. The Aztecs have neither horses nor carts. Everything is carried on human backs. The markets are noisy and crowded, traders shouting prices, buyers haggling. Somewhere there is music, somewhere children laughing. The air is filled with odors, spices and flowers, roasted corn and cocoa, incense from the temples, and the sweet smell of blood that never quite evaporates. Mexica society was divided into classes, and these boundaries were clear and immutable. At the bottom were the Masuwali, the commoners, the peasants, the bulk of the population. They worked in the fields, on the Chinampas, growing maize and beans, pumpkins and tomatoes, chili peppers and cocoa. They built houses and roads, temples and palaces. They were the backbone the foundation on which the whole empire was held together. Their lives were hard, but not hopeless. They could own land. They could trade in the markets. They could rise in society if their sons showed bravery in war or wisdom in learning. Above them stood the pili, the nobility, the aristocracy. In the beginning, the status of a pili was not hereditary. A noble became one who earned this right by military exploits, wise advice, and service to the state. But time changed this too. Gradually, nobility began to pass from father to son. Dynasties began to form. Hereditary aristocracy began to take shape. The pilis owned the best lands, wore the most luxurious clothes, decorated with quetzal feathers and gold, lived in spacious stone palaces. Their children were educated in special schools where they learnt history and religion, military and administration, writing and counting. But there was a third group that stood apart: the Pochoka, the traders. Formally, they belonged to the Masawali, but their wealth could surpass many of the pili. The Pochteca traveled throughout the empire and far beyond, across jungles and mountains, deserts and coasts. They traded in everything from simple cocoa beans to the rarest feathers of birds of paradise, from obsidian to jade. They weren't just traders. They were spies, scouts, diplomats. They brought to Tenochtitlan not only goods, but also information about distant lands, about the weakness of potential victims, about the riches that could be seized. And above them all stood Tlatoani, the ruler, the emperor, the living embodiment of the divine will. Tlatoani did not inherit the throne automatically. He was chosen by a council of elders and noble warriors from the dynasty founded by Akamapichtli in the year 1375. They chose the wisest, the bravest, the most honorable. That, at least, was the theory. In practice, of course, intrigues and political alliances, personal ambitions, and family ties played a role. There have been great rulers among the Tlatoani. Montezuma I, who ruled from 1444 to 1469th year, extended the boundaries of the empire and laid the foundations of its power. Awisotl, the fierce warrior, under whom, from 1486 to 1502, the empire reached its maximum size. These names sounded like thunder. Whole nations trembled before these men, but there was one among them whose name will forever be associated with the fall of the empire: Montezuma II, whom the Aztecs called Motecuzoma Xocoyotzin, the honorable young man. He ascended the throne in the year 1502, the sixth or eighth son of the Emperor Ashayakatl, a man educated and pious, intelligent and indecisive. In the year 1577, Montezuma II was crowned as Huey Tlatoani, a great ruler, and assumed the title Emperor of the World, an ambitious title for a man who didn't know that his world was much smaller than he realized, that somewhere far across the sea there were other worlds, other empires, other gods, and that soon those worlds would collide, and the collision would be catastrophic. Under Montezuma, an unsuccessful war was fought against Tlaxcala, an independent city-state that stubbornly resisted Aztec expansion. The Tlaxcalans were brave warriors and a proud people, and they hated the Meshchik with all their souls. This hatred, this age-old enmity, would one day play a decisive role in the fate of the empire. But Montezuma did not know this. He ruled, performed rituals, made sacrifices to the gods, expanded and decorated Tenochtitlan, and believed that his empire would last forever. And in the Mexica army, elite units were formed, illustrious and formidable. Jaguar warriors, clad in the skins of those majestic cats, fierce and undaunted. Eagle warriors, adorned with feathers, swift as the birds from which they took their name. These warriors were the color of the army, its pride, and the tip of the spear. To become a jaguar warrior or an eagle warrior meant to reach the pinnacle of military glory, to earn the respect of the whole society, to be entitled to the best lands and the most beautiful outfits. But the greatness of the empire did not rest on force of arms alone. It rested on faith, a religion that permeated every aspect of Mexique life, from dawn to dusk, from birth to death. And that religion was complicated, dark, beautiful, and terrifying at the same time. Imagine the night sky over Tenochtitlan. The stars twinkle as brightly as they did 5 centuries ago, when there were no electric lights to outshine them. The Milky Way stretches across the sky in a silvery river, and it feels like you can reach out and touch those distant lights. And on Earth, in the heart of the city, at the top of the Great Pyramid, another fire burns, a sacred fire that never goes out. And in the light of this fire, priests in black robes, with hair tangled with blood, perform a ritual that is repeated every day, every night, over and over again, without end. The Mexica religion was polytheistic. They worshipped a multitude of gods, dozens of deities, each ruling a different sphere of existence. gods of rain and drought, gods of corn and war, gods of death and fertility, gods of night and day. But among all this pantheon, two deities stood apart. Two gods who defined the very essence of Aztec civilization. The first was Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, patron of the Mexica people, the same god who had led them from legendary Aztlan to Lake Texcoco. His name meant hummingbird of the left, or hummingbird of the south. And this was no accident. The hummingbird in the Aztec view symbolized the souls of fallen warriors who accompanied the sun on its daily journey across the sky. Huitzilopochtli was depicted in full battle attire, with a shield and darts. His face was painted with blue and yellow stripes. On his head, a crown of hummingbird feathers. He was a cruel god, a god of conquest and blood. But to the Mexique, he was also a protector, a father, one who led them to greatness. The cult of Huitzilopochtli was an imperial cult. Subjugated peoples had to recognize his authority and offer sacrifices to him. This was not just a religious demand. It was a political statement. You are not only submitting to us, you are submitting to our God. You are recognizing that our God is more powerful than your gods. The second great deity was Tlaloc, the ancient rain god, who was worshipped in Central America long before the Mexica came from the north. Tlaloc was necessary because he gave rain, and rain gave crops, and crops gave life. Without Tlaloc, the corn would wither in the fields, the beans would not produce fruit, and the people would starve to death. So Tlaloc was feared and honored, prayed to, and offered gifts to him. He was depicted with a characteristic mask, round eyes like rings and fangs sticking out of his mouth. In his hands, he held a lightning snake. Rain was his gift, but he could be both generous and cruel. He could send bountiful downpours, and he could send destructive storms. He could water the earth, and he could wash away the crops with torrents of water. To these two gods, Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, was dedicated the greatest temple of the empire, the heart of Tenochtitlan, the center of the entire Mesic world. Templo Mayor, the great temple, Huay Teocalli in Nahuatl. Imagine this pyramid, 60 meters high, about the height of a 20-story building, a wide base that goes deep into the sacred precinct in the center of the city. Steps leading upwards, steep, narrow steps on which priests climbed and dragged sacrifices. At the very top, there were two shrines, two temple buildings standing side by side. The northern, right one, was dedicated to Tlaloc, and was painted blue with blue stripes, the color of water, the color of rain, the color of the sky before a thunderstorm. The southern left one belonged to Huitzilopochtli and was painted in bright red, the color of blood, the color of war, the color of the setting sun. The whole pyramid was orientated on the axis east-west, on the way of the sun, on the way of time. Here, at the top of this pyramid, rulers were crowned. Here, in the year 1502, Montezuma II took power over the empire. Here state ceremonies were held, here wars were declared, and peace was made. Here the nobility of the empire gathered at the most important moments. But most of all, this is where sacrifices were made. Human sacrifice. These words sound terrible to us, don't they? We people of the 21st century, brought up in the tradition of humanism and human rights, cannot understand how an entire civilization, great and complex, could base its religion on murder. But try for a moment to put aside our modern notions of good and evil. Try to understand the logic of another world, another time. For the Mexique, the world was a fragile place. The sun rose every morning, not because the universe worked that way, but because the gods fought the forces of darkness every day and defeated them. But the gods needed power for this fight. They needed energy, life force. And the purest, most powerful form of this energy was human blood, human heart, human life. Sacrifice was not murder as they understood it. It was a sacred exchange. People gave life to the gods, and in return, the gods kept the world alive. Without sacrifice, the sun would not rise, the rain would not fall, the corn would not grow, and the world would end, the fifth and final end. Because the Mexica believed they were living in the fifth age of creation, and the four previous worlds had already been destroyed by the gods. So they made sacrifices, regularly, systematically, on a scale that boggles the mind. Modern researchers, based on Spanish chronicles and archaeological findings, estimate the number of victims at about 20,000 annually. 20,000 lives cut short on the steps of temples, 20,000 hearts torn from their rib cages, 20,000 souls sent to the gods. Most of the victims were prisoners of war. For the Mexique, war was not only a way to expand territory and collect tribute. War was a sacred hunt for victims. Warriors didn't just go into battle to kill. They went to capture prisoners. To capture an enemy alive and bring him to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice was considered the greatest valor. There were even special wars, flower wars, as they were called, wars that were fought specifically to capture captives, wars of ritual between consenting parties. Imagine a typical sacrificial ritual. Dawn over Tenochtitlan. The city wakes up slowly. The mist rises from the lake. The first rays of sunlight gild the tops of the pyramids. In the square in front of Templo Mayor, a crowd gathers. Thousands of people, commoners and nobles, warriors and merchants, children and old people. All have come to see the sacred action. The victim is led up the steps. Sometimes it is a warrior captured in battle, proud and defiant, even in the face of death. Sometimes it is a slave bought specifically for this purpose. Sometimes, and this is especially tragic to our perception, it is a child. Children were sacrificed to Tlaloc because it was believed that their tears pleased the rain god, that children's cries were like rain and called down real rain from heaven. At the top of the pyramid, the victim is laid on the sacrificial stone, a specially worked block of stone, slightly curved, so that the body curves backwards and the rib cage juts forward. 4 assistants hold the victim by the arms and legs. A priest stands over her with an obsidian knife in his hand. Obsidian is a volcanic glass, black and sharp, sharper than any metal the Mexica knew. Obsidian was used to make blades for weapons, and obsidian shards were used to decorate macuahuitl, the wooden clubs that were the main weapons of Aztec warriors. But the most important use of obsidian was religious. It was used to make sacrificial knives. One blow, quick and precise, under the ribs. The priest's hand, trained by thousands of rituals, dives into the wound. A moment, and he rips out the heart, still beating, still warm, raises it to the sky, to the rising sun, shows the gods their food. Blood drips down his arms, down his black robes, drips onto the stone, soaks into the ancient stains of thousands of previous victims. The heart is placed in a special bowl. Quaushikali. Sometimes it was eaten by the priests, joining the divine energy. Sometimes it was burnt, sending the smoke to the heavens, to the gods. The body was decapitated. The head was separated and preserved, and the body was thrown down the steps of the pyramid, where it was dismembered. The body parts could be distributed to the warriors who captured the victim, could be used in other rituals. And the heads, the skulls of the victims, were displayed on tsompantli, special wooden racks where they hung in rows, hundreds and thousands of skulls, white in the sun, staring blankly into the square. The chronicler Diego Duran, a Spanish monk who described Tenochtitlan shortly after its conquest, claimed that the city's main tsompantli could hold 60,000 skulls. 60,000. Even if this is an exaggeration, even if the real figure was 2 or 3 times less. Imagine this picture. Imagine this wall of bones, this evidence of countless deaths. It was brutal. It was horrible. But for the Mexique, it was necessary. It was sacred. It was what separated the cosmos from chaos, life from nothingness. They weren't sadistic. They didn't enjoy suffering for the sake of suffering. They were doing what they deeply believed they had to do for the world to continue to exist. And yet, other peoples of Mesoamerica feared and hated them for this very reason. Yes, human sacrifice was practiced throughout the region. The Mayans sacrificed, the Toltecs sacrificed. Every culture in Mesoamerica knew the practice, but the Mexica outdid them all. Their thirst for blood, their scale of sacrifice, their systematic approach to extracting sacrifices through warfare, all of this caused fear and loathing among neighboring peoples. The Totonacs and the Tlaxcals, the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs all saw the Mexicas not as liberators, not as bearers of civilization, but as bloody tyrants, insatiable in their need for human sacrifice. When you pay tribute to the Aztecs, you pay not only in gold and corn, you pay with your sons and daughters, who will be taken to Tenochtitlan to have their hearts ripped out atop Templo Major. This hatred, this fear, this despair of the conquered peoples will be one of the main factors that will determine the fate of the empire. When strangers from the east come, when men in steel armor, speaking an incomprehensible language and worshiping a crucified godland, the subjugated peoples will see them not as enemies, but as potential allies. They will see a chance for liberation, an opportunity for revenge, a way to destroy the empire that has drunk their blood for generations. But all this will come later. In the meantime, in the early years of the 16th century, the Mexic Empire is at the height of its power. Tenochtitlan is growing and prospering. Montezuma II rules from his palace, surrounded by luxuries that would dazzle the Spanish conquistadors. Temples glisten in the sun. Canals carry boats carrying goods from all corners of the empire. And markets offer everything from simple maize bread to precious quetzal feathers, which were valued more than gold. The Mexica don't know that their world is coming to an end. They don't know that somewhere far across the ocean, on another continent, in a kingdom called Spain, an expedition is being prepared that will change their fate forever. They are unaware of the existence of this ocean, this continent, this kingdom. Their world is limited to Mesoamerica, and they believe themselves to be the center of this world, the most powerful nation under the sun. Perhaps there were signs. The Mexica believed in omens, in prophecies, in the gods sending signals. to those who could read them. Spanish chronicles mention strange phenomena that were observed in the years before the arrival of the conquistadors. A comet that crossed the sky and caused panic among the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. A fire in the temple of Huitzilopochtli, which caught fire by itself and could not be extinguished. Lake Texcoco, which suddenly boiled and overflowed its banks for no apparent reason. A woman crying at night, a voice echoing over the town. "Oh, my children, it is time for us to leave. Where will I take you?" Were these signs real, or were they invented later to explain the disaster? We don't know. But we do know that Montezuma was a superstitious man, deeply religious, inclined to see divine will in everything that happened. And we know that when news came of strange aliens from the east, men with white skin and beards, shrouded in metal, and floating on floating mountains, Montezuma was frightened because there was a legend. The ancient legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wisdom and wind, fair-skinned and bearded, who had once ruled the Toltecs and then gone east, promising to return one day. And this year, 1519 in the European calendar, the year of Se-Acatl in the Aztec calendar, was the year when, according to the prophecy, Quetzalcoatl was to return. Imagine the coast. A hot den on the Gulf of Mexico, the sand heated by the sun so hot that it burns your bare feet. Palm trees rustle in the light breeze, waves gently lapping at the shore. Suddenly, dots appear on the horizon, small at first, almost indistinguishable. Then they grow, get closer, turn into something unseen, huge wooden structures floating on the water, with white wings blown by the wind. Ships. But the locals don't know the word. For them, they are floating mountains, houses walking on water, a miracle and a horror at the same time. It was in the year 1518. Juan de Grijalva's expedition reached the shores of what the Spaniards would call New Spain. They did not land permanently. They did not begin a conquest. They traded with the natives, exchanged glass beads for gold, gathered information, made maps. And then they returned to Cuba with tales of rich lands in the West, of cities made of stone, of gold and jade, of a great empire that stretched far into the interior of the continent. These stories reached the ears of a man called Hernán Cortés, a hidalgo from Extremadura, an impoverished Spanish region, a man ambitious and ruthless, clever and unscrupulous. He was 34 years old and had already lived enough in Cuba to realize the real wealth and glory are not here, on this relatively poor island. They are somewhere out there, on the mainland, in the lands Grijalva spoke of. Cortés received permission for the expedition from the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez. Or rather, at first he received it, but then the governor changed his mind and tried to withdraw the permission. But it was too late. Cortés hastily assembled a fleet of 11 ships, recruited people, about 508 soldiers, 16 horses, a few cannons, and sailed before he could be stopped. This was in February of the year 1519, the year of Ese Acatl, the year that Quetzalcoatl was to return. When news of the arrival of the strange aliens reached Tenochtitlan, Montezuma sent ambassadors to them. Imagine these ambassadors, noble men in luxurious clothes, decorated with feathers and gold, carrying gifts, masks of turquoise and jade, jewelry of gold, cloaks of quetzal feathers. They met Cortés on the coast and presented these gifts to him, trying to understand, who was he? God or man? A messenger of Quetzalcoatl or an ordinary mortal? Cortés accepted the gifts and asked for more. Gold interested him most of all. Every piece of gold, every piece of jewelry that the Indians showed him fueled in him and his men an ever more fierce thirst for profit. The Spanish chronicles mention that when the Indians showed the Spaniards gold, they smiled like monkeys, rejoiced like children, and their eyes glistened with greed. Montezuma tried to pay them off. He sent more and more gifts, more and more luxurious, hoping that the Spaniards would be satisfied with what they received and sail back to the sea. But he achieved the opposite effect. Each new gift convinced Cortés that somewhere inland, in that city on the lake of which the Indians spoke, lay untold riches, that it was only necessary to reach out and take them. But Cortés wasn't just an adventurer. He was a clever man. He realized you couldn't conquer an empire with 500 soldiers. He needed allies, and he found them. The first were the Totonacs, a coastal people who paid tribute to Tenochtitlan and hated that dependence. Cortés promised them freedom from the Aztec yoke. He advised them to arrest the tribute collectors sent by Montezuma, an act of incredible audacity that should have brought terrible revenge. But vengeance did not come, because Cortés protected the Totonacs, and they believed that this strange bearded man in metal armor could really stand up to the might of the Aztecs. Then there were the Tlaxcalans, a proud people living in the city-state of Tlaxcala, which had resisted Aztec expansion for decades. The Tlaxcals were warlike and independent. They hated the Mexica with all their souls, hated for the constant wars, for the captured tribesmen, whose hearts were ripped out atop Templo Major, for the humiliation of being surrounded by enemies on all sides. When Cortés and his troop approached the borders of Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcalians attacked him first. The battle was fierce. The Indians outnumbered the Spaniards dozens of times, but the Spaniards had horses, firearms, steel armor, and swords. After a few clashes, the Tlaxcals realized that these outsiders were formidable warriors, and more importantly, enemies of their enemies. Cortés met with the rulers of Tlaxcala. He explained to them that he was going to Tenochtitlan, that he wanted to overthrow Montezuma. And the Tlaxcalans, after much debate and deliberation, decided to join him. It was a decision that would determine the fate of the empire, because the Tlaxcals didn't just give Cortés an alliance, they gave him an army, a huge army, numbering, according to various estimates, from 80 to 200,000 warriors. Think about these numbers. Cortés had about 500 Spanish soldiers, and he had 100,000 Indian warriors allied with him, eager to avenge centuries of humiliation at the hands of the Aztecs. The conquista was not so much a Spanish conquest as a civil war in Mesoamerica, where the Spanish played the role of catalyst, the tip of the spear, of technological superiority. Montezuma learnt of all this through his spies. He knew the outsiders were moving towards the capital. He knew they had made an alliance with the Tlaxcalians, and he procrastinated. This is the most puzzling part of the whole story. Why didn't Montezuma, ruler of a powerful empire with a huge army, stop Cortés when he was still weak? Why didn't he attack him on the coast, destroy him in the mountains, crush him by superior numbers? Different historians give different answers. Maybe he really believed that Cortés was Quetzalcoatl, or his messenger, and was afraid of the anger of the gods. Maybe he was just indecisive by nature, prone to doubt and hesitation. Maybe he hoped to solve the problem diplomatically, with gifts and negotiations, not realizing what kind of people he was dealing with. Or maybe, as some scholars believe, he underestimated the threat, thinking that if anything, he could always destroy this handful of outsiders. Whatever the reason, it did not stop Cortés. And in November of the year 1519, a detachment of conquistadors, accompanied by thousands of Indian allies, approached Lake Texcoco and saw Tenochtitlan. Spanish chronicles convey their amazement. They had seen Seville and Toledo, Madrid, and Barcelona, the best cities in Europe at that time. But Tenochtitlan amazed them. A city on the water, white stone and majestic, with pyramids rising to the sky, with gardens and palaces, with wide streets and canals. More than 200,000 inhabitants, more than any European city. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's detachment, later wrote in his memoirs, "We were amazed and said it was all like magic from a book about Amadis. Some of our soldiers asked if it was all a dream." Montezuma met them in person. Imagine the scene. The great ruler of the empire, dressed in luxurious robes, adorned with gold and quetzal feathers, carried on a stretcher, surrounded by nobles and warriors. And opposite him, a dirty, tired Spanish conquistador in steel armor, smelling of sweat and gunpowder. The two worlds met at the causeway leading to Tenochtitlan. They exchanged greetings through interpreters. Cortés had with him a woman named Malinche, a local girl who spoke several Indian languages and had learnt Spanish. She translated, and through her, Montezuma invited Cortés to the city, offered him hospitality, and housed him and his men in one of the palaces. It was a mistake, a fatal mistake, although Montezuma didn't know it yet, because by letting the Spaniards into the heart of his capital, he had given them a huge advantage. Cortés looked around, assessed the situation, and realized he was trapped. Yes, he was housed in a luxurious palace. Yes, he was being honored. But he is in the center of a huge city, populated by hundreds of thousands of potential enemies, on an island in the middle of a lake, from which it is impossible to escape quickly. One order from Montezuma and the Spaniards are simply wiped out, drowned in waves of Indian warriors. So Cortés did what seemed like madness. He took Montezuma hostage. Right in the palace, surrounded by Aztec nobles, he announced to Montezuma that he was now a prisoner. He was moved to the same palace where the Spaniards lived, and although formally he was given respect, although he was allowed counselors and servants, he was a prisoner. And strangest of all, Montezuma obeyed. He didn't scream. He didn't call for guards. He didn't rebel. He accepted his captivity. Why? Again, we return to the mystery of this man's character. Perhaps he hoped to buy time, to wait it out, to outwit the Spaniards. Maybe he was afraid of bloodshed in the holy city. Maybe he still believed in the divine nature of Cortés and dared not resist the will of the gods. We don't know. We only know that he remained a prisoner, and for a few months, Cortés actually ruled Tenochtitlan on his behalf. The Spaniards surveyed the city, exploring its riches, and they discovered treasures that surpassed their wildest dreams. In one of the hiding places of Montezuma's palace, they found a huge storehouse of gold, ingots and jewelry, statuettes and masks, a whole room filled with the precious metal. They saw gold on the walls of temples, gold in the jewelry of the nobility, gold everywhere. Their greed, already fueled, turned to madness. But life in Tenochtitlan was tense. The Aztecs hated the Spaniards. They saw these outsiders desecrating their temples, demanding gold, holding their ruler captive. Tensions rose day by day, like vapor pressure in a closed vessel. All it took was a spark to cause an explosion, and the spark was there. In May 1520, Cortés received news that another Spanish expedition had landed on the coast. It was led by Panfilo de Narvaez, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for disobedience. Cortés realized that if he failed to deal with Narvaez, he would lose everything. So he took a risky step. He left in Tenochtitlan only part of the detachment under the command of his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, and himself, with the main forces, went to the coast. Alvarado was a brave warrior, but a cruel and shallow man. The Aztecs nicknamed him Tonatiuh, sun, because of his red hair. And this man performed an act that would plunge Tenochtitlan into chaos. On the 22nd of May, the Aztecs asked Alvarado for permission to hold the feast of Toxcatl, one of the major religious festivals of the year, dedicated to the god Tezcatlipoca. Alvarado granted permission. Imagine the scene: the courtyard of the great temple filled with people, the nobles of the empire dressed in their finest robes, adorned with gold and feathers, jade and turquoise. Music sounds. Dancers move in a ritual dance. Thousands of people celebrate, rejoice, temporarily forgetting about the strangers who crowded their city. Suddenly, Spanish soldiers block the exits of the temple complex. Suddenly, they burst into the courtyard with swords and spears, and the carnage begins. The unarmed people, taken by surprise, are unable to resist. They are slashed and stabbed, crushed and trampled. Blood floods the stones of the courtyard. Screams mingle with the music, and the feast becomes a nightmare. More than 600 people were killed that day. 600 nobles, the color of society, unarmed participants in a religious ceremony. The Spanish later claimed they intervened to prevent human sacrifice. Aztec sources say the real reason was greed. The nobles were adorned with gold, and the Spaniards wanted to take it. Whatever the cause, the consequences were catastrophic. The city exploded in revolt. The people of Tenochtitlan took up arms. They besieged the palace where the Spaniards had taken refuge with the captive Montezuma. They attacked again and again, pelting the building with stones and arrows, trying to set it on fire, screaming for revenge. Alvarado realized he had made a terrible mistake. His handful of soldiers, trapped in the palace, surrounded by an angry mob, could not hold out much longer. Food was running out, water was scarce, and the wounded were growing in number. The Aztecs did not stop attacking day or night. Drums rattled on the tops of temples. Priests called on the gods to punish the foreigners. Warriors stormed the palace, wave after wave. In the meantime, Cortés, having broken Narvaez's detachment and joined his soldiers, he now had about 1,300 infantrymen and 97 cavalrymen, was hurrying back to Tenochtitlan. He realized from the alarming news that the situation was catastrophic, that his men were on the verge of ruin, that all he had achieved could collapse overnight. When he entered the city in late June, an ominous silence greeted him. The streets were empty, the markets closed, the canals lifeless. The city lurked like a predator before it leapt. Cortés had joined up with Alvarado's detachment, and the Spaniards now had more forces. But the situation remained desperate. They were surrounded by a hostile population in the center of a huge city on an island in the middle of the lake. Cortés tried to use Montezuma. He ordered the emperor to be taken to the roof of the palace to calm the people, to call for peace. Montezuma came out. Imagine this moment. The great ruler, the Huay Tlatoani, the emperor of the world, standing before his people. But he no longer looks great. He is a prisoner, a puppet of outsiders, a traitor in the eyes of his subjects. He began to speak, calling on the people to stop resisting. And then stones were thrown at him. His own people, people who used to fall down when he appeared, started throwing stones at him. One of the stones hit him in the head. Montezuma fell and was carried back to the palace. What happened next is one of the most controversial moments of Conquista history. A few days later, Montezuma died. But how exactly did he die? There are two versions, both equally tragic. According to the Spanish version, Montezuma died of wounds inflicted by stones thrown by his own people. He refused food, refused medical treatment, despaired, and simply died, broken by the betrayal of his subjects. In the Aztec version, the Spaniards killed him themselves. When he ceased to be useful as a hostage, when it became clear that the people no longer recognized his authority, the Spaniards slaughtered or strangled him. Perhaps it was Cortés by his own hands, perhaps by one of his soldiers. We will never know the truth. Historians argue about it to this day. But in a way, it is not so important who killed Montezuma, his own people or the Spanish conquerors. What matters is that he died a broken man, a ruler who had lost everything: power, respect, dignity, the very will to live. A man who could not defend his people, his empire, his world. After Montezuma's death, the Aztecs elected a new Tlatoani, Cuitlahuac, brother of the late emperor. And Cuitlahuac was a very different man. He did not hesitate. He did not doubt. He did not fear the wrath of the gods. He knew only one thing: the outsiders must be destroyed. The siege of the palace intensified. Cortés realized that to stay in Tenochtitlan meant death. He had to break out. So he took the desperate step of retreating across the lake along one of the dikes on the night of the 30th of June. That night has gone down in history as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrow. The Spaniards packed up everything they could carry: the gold they had looted during their months in the city, weapons, and supplies. Many soldiers stuffed their pockets and bags with gold jewelry, not realizing that this gold would be their death, that its weight would pull them to the bottom when they fell into the water. Deep in the night, in darkness and silence, the Spaniards began to leave the palace. They moved slowly, cautiously, careful not to make noise. With them came their Tlaxcali allies, several hundred warriors. They came to a causeway, a narrow road leading across the lake to the shore. But the Aztecs did not sleep. They had sentries, watchers on the temples, men who watched every movement of the enemy. And when the column of Spaniards stretched across the causeway, when they found themselves in the open space between water and water, the Aztecs attacked. Drums rattled, shells howled, thousands of canoes floated out of the darkness. Warriors climbed the causeway on both sides, firing bows, throwing spears and darts, and chopping with swords with obsidian blades. The Spaniards tried to break through, but the Aztecs had dismantled bridges in several places on the causeway, and the column was stuck, piled up, chaotic. People fell into the water, drowning, dragged down by the weight of armor and gold. Horses slid on wet rocks and fell, dragging their riders with them. The wounded screamed for help, but there was no one to help. Everyone was trying to save themselves. The Aztecs pulled the captives alive out of the water to sacrifice them to Huitzilopochtli on the summit of Templo Major. By dawn, those who could escape had reached the shore. Cortés gathered the remnants of his force under a tree, later to be called the Night of Sorrow tree, and counted the casualties. About 800 Spaniards had been killed or captured. Almost all the artillery was lost. The gunpowder was wet and useless. Almost all the gold was left at the bottom of Lake Texcoco. Most of the horses were lost. Of the allied Indians, only half survived. It was a disaster. Cortés, according to contemporaries, wept under that tree, realizing the scale of the defeat. The end seemed near. The Aztec army was pursuing them, and the weary, wounded detachment had no chance ahead of them. But Cortés was a remarkable man. No matter how we feel about his moral character, there is no denying his military genius and indomitable will. He gathered his men and led them on, and a few days from Tenochtitlan, at Otumba, there was a battle that changed everything. The Aztec army overtook the Spaniards on the open plain. Thousands of warriors, perhaps tens of thousands. Sources differ in their estimate, but all agree that the Indians outnumbered the Spaniards many times over. It was to be a massacre, the final destruction of the outsiders. But Cortés still had cavalry. Not many, a few dozen horsemen, but in open battle they were worth hundreds of infantrymen. Cortés saw in the center of the Aztec army a commander, a noble warrior in luxurious clothes with a large banner behind his back, around which the guards clustered. This was the commander, the man who led the entire army. Cortés gathered all the riders who could hold a saddle and led them in a desperate attack straight into the center of the enemy army. Horses broke through the crowd, hooves trampled people, riders chopped right and left, and they reached the warlord. One of the conquistadors knocked him down and tore off his banner. For the Aztecs, the loss of the banner and commander meant the end. It was a signal of defeat, a sign that the gods had turned their backs on the army. The army trembled and then ran. Panic spread instantly. Thousands of warriors scattered across the plain, throwing down their weapons, fleeing for their lives. The Spaniards had won. It was an incredible victory, bordering on a miracle. Cortés led the remnants of his troop to the safety of Tlaxcala, where their allies welcomed them, gave them shelter, food, and time to recover. And there, in Tlaxcala, Cortés began to plan his revenge. He wasn't going to leave. He was going to come back and destroy Tenochtitlan. But first, he needed a fleet. The dams, as the Night of Sorrows had shown, were a trap. To take a city on the water, you need ships. So Cortés built them, 13 brigantines, light warships with oars and sails. They were built at Tlaxcala, then taken apart, and 8,000 Indian porters carried the pieces over the mountains to Lake Texcoco, where the ships were reassembled. In the meantime, Cuitlahuac died in Tenochtitlan. He ruled for only 80 days and died not from the Spanish sword, but from a disease. It was smallpox brought by the Europeans, against which the Indians had no immunity. The new and last Tlatoani was Cuauhtémoc, a young, brave warrior, nephew of Montezuma. His name meant falling eagle, and he was determined to defend his city to the last. On the 13th of May, 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés now had about 900 Spanish soldiers, but more importantly, he had with him a huge army of allies. The Tlaxcals, Totonacs, and other peoples eager for revenge against the Aztecs. According to various estimates, between 80 and 200,000 Indian warriors took part in the siege. This was not the Spanish conquista. It was the revenge of subjugated peoples against their oppressors. Brigantines blockaded the lake, cutting the city off from supplies. The Allies stormed the dams, broke into the city, fought in the streets and canals. The Aztecs fought desperately, defending every house, every temple, every stone of their city. Cuauhtémoc was everywhere, inspiring the warriors, leading the defense, personally participating in the battles. The siege lasted 3 months. 3 months of continuous fighting, hunger, thirst, despair. The Spanish and their allies methodically destroyed the city, burning houses, filling in canals, turning beautiful Tenochtitlan into ruins. The Aztecs were running out of food, running out of water. The Spaniards poisoned or cut off fresh water sources. The Aztecs were running out of arrows, running out of strength, but worse than the war was the disease. Smallpox mowed down the defenders of the city, killing faster than Spanish swords. People died in their homes, in the streets, with no one to bury them. The military disaster was joined by an epidemiological one. The Indians had never encountered European diseases. They had no immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza. What was an unpleasant but tolerable disease for a European became a death sentence for an Indian. On the 13th of August, in the year 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured as he tried to flee the city in a canoe. He was brought before Cortés, and he said the words that history has preserved. "I did all I could to protect my kingdom and my subjects. Since fortune has been against me, take this dagger and kill me." Cortés did not kill him immediately. Cuauhtémoc was too valuable as a hostage. He was tortured to find out where the gold was hidden. He was held captive for several years, and then, during a campaign in Honduras, Cortés ordered him hanged, suspecting him of conspiracy. This was the ignominious end of the last ruler of the Mexica Empire. Tenochtitlan was dead, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, a white stone miracle, a city of temples and gardens, had turned into ruins. The Spaniards methodically destroyed the pyramids, razed the palaces to the ground, and filled in the canals. On the site of Templo Major, the great temple where sacrifices were once made to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, they built a Christian cathedral. On the ruins of Tenochtitlan, a new capital, Mexico City, the center of the viceroyalty of New Spain, arose. But the military conquest was only the beginning of the catastrophe. The real destruction of the Mexica civilization took place in the following decades, and the cause was not swords, but germs. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and later typhus swept through Mexico in wave after wave. In the 16th century, epidemics killed some 15 million people, more than 80% of the region's total population. In the year 1545, a particularly terrible epidemic broke out, which the Indians called Cocolitztli, disease, in the Nahuatl language. Modern researchers, having studied the remains of the victims, have determined that it was typhoid fever, caused by the bacterium Salmonella enterica. The epidemic affected between 12 and 15 million people. Imagine the scale of this catastrophe. An entire civilization, numbering millions of people, reduced to a pitiful remnant. Villages and towns deserted, fields overgrown with weeds. The temples that the Spaniards didn't destroy crumbled from neglect. Knowledge, traditions, arts, all these were lost with the death of the old men who remembered the old days and could pass them on to the young. But there were fewer and fewer young people. History, as always, is written by the victors. Spanish chroniclers described the conquista as a great deed, the triumph of Christianity over paganism, the victory of civilization over barbarism. They did not forget to mention the cruelty of the Aztecs, their human sacrifices, the Tzompantli, with thousands of skulls. And it is true, the Mexica did practice ritual murder on a scale that boggles the imagination, but the Spanish also committed crimes. The massacre at the Great Temple is just one example. There were other massacres, torture, enslavement. Indians were forced into hard labor in the mines, where they died by the thousands. They were forcibly converted to Christianity by destroying temples and burning sacred books, codices containing centuries of accumulated knowledge. In our time, this story is sparking a new debate. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador demanded that Spain and the Pope apologize for the crimes of the conquista, calling it done with the sword and the cross. The Spanish government rejected the demand, calling it strange and offensive. Who is right in this debate? Can people of the 16th century be judged by the standards of the 21st? Were the Spanish unambiguous villains and the Aztecs innocent victims? Or conversely, were the conquistadors liberators who saved the Indians from bloody tyranny? The truth, as always, is more complicated than any simple answers. Yes, the Mexica practiced human sacrifice on a horrific scale. Yes, the subjugated peoples hated them for it and helped the Spanish destroy the empire. But the Spaniards didn't come as noble liberators either. They came for gold, driven by greed and ambition. And the price Mesoamerica paid for the fall of the Mexica Empire was monstrous. Millions of lives, lost civilization, destroyed world. Today, there is almost nothing left of Tenochtitlan. Mexico City is built on its ruins, and only archaeological excavations allow us to see glimpses of former greatness. In 1978, construction workers accidentally stumbled upon a large stone relief depicting the goddess Coyolxauhqui, and this discovery initiated the systematic excavation of Templo Mayor. Archaeologists discovered that the pyramid was a sequence of structures built one on top of the other. Each new generation of Aztecs built their temple on top of the temple of their ancestors. These excavations have given us artifacts, treasures, the remains of victims, material evidence of that complex, brutal, magnificent civilization. We can study their skulls, read the Spanish chronicles, examine the surviving codices. But can we truly understand them? Understand the people who believed that the sun would not rise unless fed with blood? Understand the priests who tore hearts from rib cages and considered it a sacred duty? Understand the warriors who went into battle not to kill, but to capture captives for sacrifice? Maybe not. Maybe the gulf of time and culture is too great. But we can remember. Remember that there was such an empire, that such a people lived, that such a city stood. Remember the greatness, the cruelty, the tragedy. Remember Montezuma, torn between loyalty to the gods and political reality. Remember Cuauhtémoc, the young eagle, defending his city to the last. To remember the millions of nameless people, peasants and warriors, priests and merchants, children and old men who lived, loved, hoped, feared, and died in that distant world that disappeared 5 centuries ago. Their story is a reminder of the fragility of civilizations, of how quickly what seemed eternal can crumble, how the meeting of different worlds can turn into a disaster for both. That history is rarely simple, that there are no pure heroes and pure villains, only people, complex, contradictory, capable of greatness and horror. And as we fall asleep tonight, in our quiet rooms, in our modern world, we can imagine for a moment that other night, 500 years ago, when fires burned on Lake Texcoco, when drums resounded in the air, when at the top of the Great Pyramid, a priest raised a still beating heart to the sky, when an empire was unknowingly living out its last days. Good night, my dear listeners. May you have good dreams. Let the story we recalled together today remind you of how amazing and complex our world is, how many different paths mankind has traveled, how many worlds have arisen and disappeared on this ancient land. Until next time, until new stories in the silence of the night.